One of the secrets of Mikhail Tal's magic was his strong intuition. In complicated positions, when it was impossible to calculate all variations, he relied on his gut feeling and sacrificed material instinctively. In this game, he intuitively sacrifices 3 pawns to open as many files and diagonals as possible in order to activate his pieces and prepare the ground for a deadly attack on the enemy king. Tal starts with e4. His opponent Donner plays the French defense e6, d4, d5, knight c3, bishop b4. Whenever variation, pinning the knight, which is defending the pawn, so black is threatening to capture on e4. That's why the pawn crosses the center of the board and white gets the space advantage on the king side and in the center. Black immediately attacks the base of white's pawn chain, as white cannot retain the pawn chain by playing c3, because the knight, of course, is blockading the c-pawn. But white can play a3, and after the exchange on c3, white's pawn structure on the queen side is damaged. White has the doubled pawns and an isolated pawn, but in return, white has retained his pawn chain and also got the advantage of 2 bishops. Donner plays queen c7 and Tal develops his knight. And here the natural move for black would have been knight e7, for example, developing the king's knight. But instead, black played b6, intending to solve black's main problem in the French defense, namely the problem of the bad light-squared bishop, which is restricted by its own pawns on the light squares. So black is going to play bishop a6 in order to exchange his bad bishop for white's good bishop. But the drawback of this plan is that it takes a lot of time, and as a result, black will fall behind in development. Tal plays a4, vacating the a3 square for his bishop, and this bishop will play a very important role in this game, as you will see. Black plays bishop a6, this leads to the exchange of the bishops, and Tal develops his queen with a tempo, attacking the knight, and also actually forcing the knight to return to its initial position. Because if black defends the knight, then white can simply play queen b5 check, and the black king would lose the right to castle in this case. Neither can black make a tempting move, namely c takes d, leaving his knight under attack but threatening to capture on c3 with the double attack. It doesn't work, because before capturing the knight, white would give a check, forcing the black king to move to a dark square, and after the king moves, let's say to f8, then with a tempo the bishop would move away from c1, check, and the rooks would be connected, and only after black plays knight e7, white can safely capture the knight, because queen takes c3 check doesn't win the rook, because after king e2 the rooks are connected. Black can only capture one more pawn, but after knight d2 there are no more checks and white is up a piece. And if the king moves to f8, to d8 instead of f8, then again, white can safely capture the knight, because after queen takes c3 check and king e2, again the rook is untouchable, because simple tactics, bishop g5 check with the discovered attack on the queen. So after queen e2, the knight must return to its initial square, and now black is behind in development. However, black needs just 2 tempi in order to castle kingside and solve all his problems. So that means white must play energetically, try to open as many files and diagonals as possible, as soon as possible, while the black king is still in the center and the pieces are still undeveloped. And that's exactly what Tal does. He is going to move his bishop to a3, but the a3 f8 diagonal is currently closed by the c-pawn, which is supported by the b-pawn. So black has the pawn chain, which will restrict the bishop once it moves to a3. So Tal decided to destroy this pawn chain. In order to achieve that, he sacrifices the first pawn, a5. He is threatening to capture on b6, after which black won't be able to retain his pawn chain by capturing with the a-pawn, because in this case, of course, the rook would fall. That's why Donner accepted the pawn sacrifice. But now that the pawn is deflected from b6, it isn't defending the c5 pawn. That means it will be easier for white to open this diagonal for his bishop. Besides that, the b file is open for white's major pieces. Of course, Tal immediately plays bishop a3, threatening to capture on c5. That's why black plays knight d7. Now, if the bishop captures, of course, black will exchange his knight for the bishop. So Tal captures with the pawn. And knight e7 followed. Now black is ready to play knight c6, attacking the e5 pawn 3 times and, which is even more important, blockading the c pawn, after which the bishop would turn into a very bad piece. So, in order to prevent this, Tal again sacrifices the pawn, moving it forward in order to open the diagonal for his bishop. Now, if the knight captures, attacking the e5 pawn 3 times, white can, of course, play bishop d6 with a tempo, defending his pawn, and the bishop is greatly placed, the queen is under attack, black doesn't have any counterplay, black's position is very passive, and the king cannot castle. So, instead, of course, Donner captured on c6 with his queen, in order to exert pressure on the c-file. He is threatening to capture on c3 with the double attack, but Tal sacrifices the second pawn. He is leaving this pawn under attack and castles kingside in order to finish his development. And now we can see Tal's idea behind these sacrifices. His bishop is very strong. It's very effective, preventing the black king from castling. Of course, if black castles, the knight would fall. And as the king is stuck in the center, there is no way to develop the king's rook, while the white king is absolutely safe and the white rooks are ready to join the game, the play. So, besides that, white is threatening to play knight d4, occupying the great blockading square with a tempo, attacking the queen. And after that, after knight d4, if the black queen captures on c3, the knight would jump to b5, again with a tempo, attacking the queen, and also creating multiple threats. Knight c7, knight d6 check, that would be very unpleasant. So, in order to prevent this, Donner accepts the sacrifice of the second pawn. Queen takes c3, taking under control the d4 square, preventing the knight from jumping to d4. Tal simply continues his development and renews the threat. The rook is now controlling the d4 square, and white is threatening to play knight d4, with very unpleasant knight b5 after that. So, black plays knight c6, taking under control the d4 square and attacking the e5 pawn 3 times, but simply bishop d6, defending the pawn, and now the bishop not only prevents the black king from castling, but also takes under control the b8 square, preventing the rook from occupying the open b file. Donner plays queen c4, offering the exchange of the queens, which would decrease white's initiative, of course. So Tal avoids the exchange, queen e3. One more time Donner suggests to exchange queens, and one more time Tal avoids it and creates an immediate threat, queen b7, with the double attack. That's why black plays knight b6, closing the queen's way to b7. And we have reached the critical position. Black is 2 pawns up, and white has a very good compensation for the material. However, it isn't clear how white can develop his initiative and increase his pressure. Tal found a brilliant solution. You can pause the video and try to find his next move. So, the first move that comes to mind is queen b5, of course, pinning the knight and threatening to capture it. But it doesn't work, because black can simply play queen c4, defending the knight, and one more time offering the exchange of the queens. So white will have to spend another tempo to avoid the exchange in this case. So queen b5 doesn't work. Tal's move was much more creative. He needs more open lines in order to increase his pressure, namely the c-file for his rooks, which is currently closed by his c-pawn. So, in order to open this file, he sacrifices the third pawn, c4. On c4, the pawn is attacked 3 times, but it turns out that the knight cannot actually capture it. That is losing on the spot, of course, after queen b7 with the double attack, black is losing. And in case black captures with the pawn, now that the pawn is occupying the c4 square and preventing the queen from moving to c4, now queen b5 is very effective, pinning the knight, attacking it. The only defender of the knight is the queen, but white is threatening to play rook d4, kicking the queen out, after which the knight would fall. The only way to defend the knight would be rook c8, but now that the rook has moved from a8 and isn't defending the a7 pawn, and as the knight is pinned, it isn't defending a7 or a5, white can simply capture on a5, followed by rook takes a7, after which the knight would be under attack and white would threaten very unpleasant rook e7 check, of course. So, after c4, Donner captured with the queen. But now the c-file is open for white rooks, and both the queen and the knight are placed on this file, so both of these pieces will turn into the target of attack of white rook. But first, of course, white again must avoid the exchange of the queens. Queen a3, creating an immediate threat, rook c1, attacking the queen, and after the queen moves, the knight would fall. The only move after rook c1 in order to save the knight would be queen b5, but that doesn't help, because rook c5 would follow, again kicking the queen out, after which the knight would fall. So, in order to prevent all this, Donner decided to move his queen away from the c-file in advance, before the white rook moves to c1. Queen a6. And still rook c1 followed with the tempo attacking the knight, and rook c8 defending it. So, how to continue the attack? How to develop the initiative? Almost all black pieces are placed on the queen side, except the rook, which isn't doing anything on h8. Besides that, the pawn on g7 is weakened, so all these pieces won't be able to defend the king side. That means it would make sense to start the attack on the king side. The bishop is greatly placed on d6. Both rooks are also greatly placed, but the queen isn't really doing much on a3. So, Tal will transfer his queen to the king side in order to start attacking the g7 pawn. But at the moment the knight is standing in front of the queen, so he simply moves it away and creates a very unpleasant threat, queen g3. Besides that, the knight on d2 controls the c4 square, preventing the black knight from jumping on this square. That might have been quite unpleasant, because the knight would attack white's best piece, the bishop on d6. Besides that, later in the game, the knight might, of course, occupy the c5 square with a tempo, and on c5 the knight would be greatly placed. So what to do? How to deal with queen g3? Donner played f6 in order to respond to queen g3 with king f7, defending the pawn, connecting his rooks, and also attacking the annoying e5 pawn, which restricts his position. But the drawback of this move of f6 is that it seriously weakens the king side. First, Tal captures on f6, and now black has a new weakness on the king side, f6. So instead of g3, the queen moves to f3, attacking the pawn. How to defend it? If king f7, then queen h5 check is possible, and after king g7, white gets a very strong attack after bishop f4, threatening bishop h6 check. Besides that, the rook might join the attack. That would be simply devastating. Probably the best move for black would have been knight d7, defending the pawn, and of course white's attack would still be very strong after queen h5 check. White has an advantage, but black could have tried to continue the resistance. Instead of this, Donner played king d7, leaving his pawn under attack but attacking the bishop in his turn. But it turns out that after queen takes f6, the bishop is untouchable. In case black captures it, then knight e4 check would follow. Of course, black cannot capture the knight as the pawn is pinned. The king must move, but where? It has only two squares. If d7, then knight c5 check with the fork. And if king moves to c7, then still knight c5 would follow, attacking the queen. The queen must move, and after queen e2, queen g7 check is possible. And what to do now? If the king moves to b8, then checkmate in 1 on b7 would follow. If the king moves to d6, then again checkmate on b7. This time the knight would checkmate the king. And finally, if the king moves to d8, then it will stand between the rooks and white can simply capture the rook. That's why after queen takes f6, Donner finally develops his king's rook, rook e8. But still knight e4 followed, with a terrible threat, knight c5 with the fork. It turns out that again the knight, this time the knight, is untouchable. After d takes e, the d file would open and white would play queen g7 check. And what to do now? After knight e7, bishop takes e7 with the discovered check, and after knight d5, checkmate in 2, bishop f6 check, and after king moves to d6, bishop e5 checkmate would follow. That's why after knight e4, Donner played knight e7, opening his rook's way in order to give up the exchange for the intolerable knight after knight c5 check. Rook takes c5, bishop takes c5 followed. Donner plays knight c4, activating his knight, but after bishop takes e7, it turns out that if black captures the bishop, white has a deadly blow. Rook takes d5 check. Of course, black cannot capture the rook because the queen would fall. In case the king moves to c6, let's say to c6, then the rook is under attack, the knight is pinned, white's rook is under attack, but he simply moves his rook and attacks the knight twice, and the rook is hanging. So, of course, black is losing. And finally, if knight d6, then rook c7 check. And after king takes, first the rook falls, and after the king moves, the knight falls. That's why after bishop takes e7, Donner resigned. And now I recommend watching a game in which Tal sacrificed his queen to start a deadly king hunt. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.